The Allies didn't nearly lose the Battle of the Atlantic because German U-boats were unbeatable. They nearly lost it because their own navy believed one dangerous lie, that bigger explosions meant better kills. That belief ruled the ocean for decades, but until a single attack exposed it at once. If this sounds different from the World War II stories you usually hear, stay with me. This war wasn't decided by bigger guns. It was decided by a belief that nearly killed thousands. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was not being lost because Allied sailors lacked courage, ships, or determination. It was being lost because of a belief so deeply embedded in naval thinking that almost no one questioned it anymore. For decades, the dominant assumption was simple and intuitive. If submarines were hard to kill, the solution was to hit them with more explosive force. Bigger charges, deeper blasts, wider patterns, more noise, more destruction. It felt logical, it sounded decisive, and it was catastrophically wrong. Depth charges had become the symbol of modern naval power. Heavy steel drums packed with hundreds of pounds of high explosive dropped again and again into the ocean like blunt instruments. To the men on deck, the explosions felt reassuring. Water erupted into towering columns. Shockwaves rolled across the sea. It looked like action. But beneath the surface, the mathematics told a different story. Every time a destroyer released a pattern of depth charges, it also erased its own ability to see. The explosions did not just threaten the submarine. They shattered sonar contact, flooding the water with noise and chaos. For minutes at a time, escort ships were effectively blind. During those minutes, the submarine did exactly what submarines were designed to do. It slipped away. This was the hidden contradiction at the heart of Allied anti-submarine warfare. The very act of attacking destroyed the information needed to succeed. Escorts were not hunting submarines as they were. They were attacking where submarines had been moments earlier, guessing blindly, hoping that raw explosive force would compensate for lost precision. Most of the time it did not. The results were brutal. Convoys burned while escorts exhausted themselves chasing shadows. Merchant sailors watched violent detonations tear the sea apart, believing that salvation was close, only to see torpedoes strike again hours later. From the bridge it felt like relentless effort. From the statistics it was near futility. Yet the belief endured. Naval doctrine treated depth charges as proven weapons, not because they worked well, but because nothing else had replaced them. Over time, the distinction blurred. Familiarity became credibility. Tradition became authority. Officers trusted what they had trained, with what manuals endorsed, what generation before them had accepted. It was to double down: more charges, tighter intervals, larger patterns. The logic was circular. If attacks failed, commanders assumed they had simply not been forceful enough. If submarines escaped, the conclusion was that the enemy had become more skilled or more numerous, not that the method itself was broken. The idea that explosive power might be the problem rather than the solution felt almost heretical. And this was where the real danger lay, because beliefs that feel obvious rarely get tested. They get protected inside planning rooms and tactical schools. Anti-submarine warfare became an exercise in refinement rather than reinvention. Charts were adjusted, but the core assumption remained untouched. Killing submarines meant overwhelming them with blast force. Precision was secondary. Information was expendable. Noise was acceptable. Meanwhile, the arithmetic of war kept worsening. Submarines did not need to win every encounter. They only needed to survive often enough to keep shipping losses ahead of replacement rates. Each failed attack was not just a miss, it was a warning. The submarine heard the charges, it learned the escort's position, it adjusted its escape. The ocean became a classroom where one side learned rapidly, while the other repeated the same lesson, convinced it was teaching instead of being taught. What made this belief especially lethal was that it was reinforced by appearances. Depth charges looked effective. They felt powerful. They produced visible violence, hedgehog-like precision. Weapons, by contrast, looked weak by comparison. Smaller charges, quieter in spectacle, and shock. Such ideas felt inadequate, even erasures. Bigger explosions meant better kills. Loud meant lethal. Force meant success. until the consequences became impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1943, the Allies were no longer debating food reserves, fuel stocks, and ship losses, for all being measured against time. For the first time, the question was no longer how to improve existing weapons, but whether the belief behind them had been wrong from the start, and that question would not come from an admiral. It would come from someone who looked at the numbers and asked a dangerous thing. What if the problem was not the submarine, but the way the Navy believed submarines should be killed? By the time anyone dared to question Allied doctrine, the Atlantic had already become a graveyard measured in tonnage, not names. The war at sea was no longer fought by heroics or single engagements. It was fought by arithmetic, and the arithmetic was unforgiving. Britain was an island nation running on imports. Food, oil, raw materials, ammunition, even replacement ships themselves had to cross the ocean. Before the war, over 50 million tons of supplies arrived every year by sea. That flow could tolerate losses in peacetime. In war, it became a lifeline measured in weeks. German submarines undefeat the Royal Navy. They did not need to annihilate convoys. They only needed to sink ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Every freighter lost tightened the noose. Every tanker destroyed shortened the clock. By late 1942, the situation was deteriorating faster than Allied planners were willing to admit publicly. Hundreds of thousands of tons disappeared beneath the waves. Month after month, shipyards worked at full capacity, but steel and labor could not outrun torpedoes forever. The margin was shrinking. This was not a sudden collapse. It was the result of a stress days of the war. Early convoy escorts had been designed for surface threats, not underwater hunters. Sonar was still primitive. Radar coverage had gaps measured in hundreds of miles. Aircraft could protect convoys only near coastlines. In the vast middle of the Atlantic, known as the air gap, submarines operated with near impunity. They coordinated attacks in packs, shadowing convoys until nightfall, then striking from multiple angles. Stroke chase struck from unexpected bearings. Survivors spoke of ships exploding without warning, flames racing across black water, and lifeboats drifting among debris fields. But stretched for miles, the psychological was enormous. Escort commanders faced an impossible mandate: protect every ship, detect an enemy that could remain hidden indefinitely, and destroy it, using weapons that required guesswork at best. And still, Doctrine held anti-submarine warfare schools for experiment, not revolution. Affirmation. If enough explosives were dropped, surely one would land close enough to kill. Statistics quietly undermined that confidence. For every successful submarine kill, dozens of attacks failed. Escorts expended thousands of depth charges with little to show for it. Worse, many attacks were launched against phantom contacts, thermal layers, schools of fish, wake turbulence. Even the echoes of friendly ships triggered alarms. Crews attacked because doctrine demanded action, not because information justified it. Each attack taught submarines how escort behaved. Each explosion announced plan to anticipate patterns, to dive at the right moment to exploit acoustic chaos. The sea itself became an ally, bending sound waves and swallowing noise. German command noticed the trend quickly. Losses existed, but they were acceptable. Pricing rates remained steady. Submarine crews rotated. Draining PICO was sustainable. From London's, it was catastrophic. Food reserves were counted in months, oil reserves in weeks. The convoy system, the backbone of Britain's survival, was bleeding. Every delay in adaptation multiplied the cost. Yet change remained slow. The reason was not ignorance. It was inertia. Naval institutions are built on continuity. Procedures are inherited. To admit that the core anti-submarine weapon had been fundamentally flawed for decades was not merely an operation admission. It was an indictment of generations of training, procurement, and leadership. So the language softened. Depth charges were described as imperfect but necessary. Failures were attributed to bad luck, insufficient numbers. The idea that the weapon itself created the conditions for failure was rarely spoken aloud. When alternatives appeared, they were judged by the standards of the old belief. Smaller explosives looked weak. Quieter attacks looked ineffective. Weapons that did not produce towering columns of water felt unsatisfying, even suspicious. And this bias mattered, because while the Allies debated refinement, the enemy adapted faster. U-boat commanders learned to exploit blind spots with precision. They timed dives. They adjusted depths. They listened. Every failed attack confirmed what they already suspected. Escorts could be manipulated. The Atlantic became a chessboard where one side repeated familiar openings, while the other learned the counters. By March 1943, the crisis reached its peak. Losses spiked. Convoys were mauled. Escorts stretched thin. There were not enough ships to protect every route, not enough aircraft to close the air gap, not enough time to wait for incremental improvement. For the first time, the question shifted from optimization to survival. This was the moment when established wisdom stopped being reassuring and started being dangerous, when belief hardened into liability. Somewhere within the bureaucracy, amid charts and casualty figures, a quiet realization began to surface. Not yet a solution, not yet a revolution, just a crack in certainty. If overwhelming force had been the answer, the war would already be won. And if the enemy kept escaping, perhaps it was not because the explosions were too small. Perhaps it was because they were happening in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong reason. The next step would not be taken by an admiral rewriting doctrine overnight. It would begin with a single question that naval thinking had avoided for years. What if the goal was not to drown the ocean in explosives, but to never lose sight of the target in the first place? The failure of Allied anti-submarine warfare did not come from weak weapons or poor crews. It came from a misunderstanding of what the real battle was about. The war beneath the waves was not a contest of explosive force. It was a contest of time. Submarines did not survive because they were indestructible. They survived because they could move while their hunters could not see. A submerged submarine was slow by surface standards, but speed was not the point. At 7 knots underwater, a submarine could travel just over 12 feet per second. That did not sound impressive until the hidden variable was accounted for: time without observation. Every depth charge attack created that time. The moment explosives detonated, sonar became useless. Sound bounced wildly through the water, overlapping, distorting, collapsing into meaningless noise. For the attacking ship, the submarine effectively ceased to exist. No bearing, no range, no depth, just silence and turbulence. In those minutes, the submarine captain did exactly what Doctrine told him to do. He ordered a crash dive, flooded ballast tanks, and angled down sharply as the destroyer thundered overhead. The submarine slipped beneath thermal layers where temperature differences bent sonar waves. It did not need to outrun its attacker. It only needed to be somewhere else when the noise cleared. By the time sonar contact returned, the submarine could be hundreds of yards away from its last known position. Sometimes more, the escort resumed its search, not from certainty but from hope, or at least slow enough that guesswork would suffice. Depth charges were dropped in patterns designed to cover a volume of water, as if the enemy were frozen inside it. But submarines were not targets pinned to coordinates. They were moving objects in a three-dimensional space, reacting instantly to threats. It bent sound. It hid movement. Explosions that looked devastating from the surface translated into brief pressure waves that dissipated rapidly. A depth charge had to detonate within a few dozen feet of the hull. Anything farther produced noise, fear, and spectacle, but not destruction. This meant that success depended on precision, and precision depended on continuous information. Depth charges provided neither. They were designed for an earlier era when submarines were slower. By the Second World War, they had become relics disguised as solutions. Their design had barely changed in decades, while submarine tactics had evolved relentlessly, satisfying. Big explosions felt decisive. They reassured crews and commanders alike that something had been done. Silence, by contrast, felt like failure. A weapon that struck quietly or not at all felt inadequate, even if it was mathematically superior. This bias toward spectacle blinded planners to the real problem. It was about whether you ever stopped seeing the enemy. Once that insight was articulated, the implications were uncomfortable. If continuous contact was the key, then traditional attacks were not just inefficient. They were counterproductive. Every missed depth charge attack made the next attack less likely to succeed. The system punished persistence. Statistic confirmed what logic suggested. The vast majority of attacks achieved nothing. Some escorts conducted dozens of attacks against the same contact without ever scoring a hit. This created a feedback loop of failure. More attacks generated more noise generated more uncertainty led to more attacks. From the outside, it looked like relentless effort. From within the system, it felt like duty. From the enemy's perspective, it was predictable. German submarine commanders learned to exploit this predictability. They timed dives to coincide with attack runs. They waited for explosions to mask their movement. They trusted that escorts would lose contact, because they almost always did. What made this even more dangerous was that occasional success reinforced the belief. Depth charges did sink submarines. But those rare successes were enough to justify the doctrine in the minds of its defenders. Each confirmed kill became proof that the system worked, even as hundreds of failures were dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable. This selective memory protected the belief from scrutiny, but the war did not care about belief, it cared about outcomes. By the time Allied planners began to confront the numbers honestly, it was clear that incremental improvement would not be enough. Faster reloads, tighter patterns, larger charges, none of it addressed the central flaw. As long as attacks destroyed information, the submarine retained the advantage. The solution, therefore, could not be an improved depth charge. It had to be something that broke the sequence entirely, a weapon that attacked without blinding, a method that preserved contact, a system that punished movement instead of enabling it. This was a radical departure from everything anti-submarine warfare had been built around. It inverted priorities. Explosive power became secondary. Timing and geometry became primary. Accuracy replaced intimidation, and this was precisely why. That courage had been wasted on methods that felt right but worked poorly. That tradition had delayed survival. No institution welcomes that conclusion easily, which is why the next step did not come from within established doctrine. It did not emerge from a committee or a revised manual. It came from a question that sounded almost naive. What if attacking a submarine should never cost you the ability to track it? Once that question was asked, the answer became unavoidable. And once the answer existed, it exposed just how dangerous the old belief had been. Because the problem was never that the ocean was too vast. It was that the Navy had been choosing again and again to fight blind. The idea itself was dangerous, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. If continuous contact was the key to killing submarines, then anti-submarine warfare had been built on the wrong priority. For decades, that conclusion did not require secret intelligence, a willingness to question what everyone else accepted as obvious. That willingness did not come from the Admiralty. It came from outside the system. He was not a ship's captain. He had never commanded a convoy under fire. He did not wear a naval uniform, and he did not speak the language of tradition. His training was in chemistry and mathematics, not naval doctrine. To the officers who had spent their careers at sea, this alone made him suspect. His name mattered less than his position. He was an outsider with access to a problem. The insiders had no lied when he began observing anti-submarine operations. He saw repetition, the same approach, executed with discipline, producing the same disappointing results. Destroyers accelerated, charges were released, sonar vanished. Silence followed, then nothing, again and again. To the crews, this was combat. To him it looked like a system failing predictably. What struck him was not how violent the attacks were, but how quickly and distant fared. The sonar operators were doing their jobs well right up until the moment the attack began. Then they were blind by design. It was not an accident, it was procedure, and that was the moment the question formed. Why accept blindness as a cost of attacking? This was not a technical question at first. It was a logical one. If the goal of hunting was to maintain contact until the moment of destruction, then any weapon that erased contact before that moment was inherently flawed. No amount of explosive power could compensate for lost information. When he voiced this thought aloud, it landed poorly to experienced officers. Sonar interference was a known limitation. Everyone accepted it. The idea that this limitation should be eliminated rather than endured felt unrealistic. Even dangerous war, after all, was not solved by perfect conditions. It was fought under constraints. But this response missed the point and refinement of existing tactics. He was rejecting their foundation. He was arguing that the accepted constraints were not imposed by nature or physics, but by habit. That distinction mattered. He began working backward from the problem rather than forward from the weapon. Instead of asking how to make depth charges better, he asked what an ideal attack would look like if it were designed today, without regard for precedent. The answer was unsettlingly clear. An ideal attack would not announce itself with thunderous explosions. It would not require guessing depth or predicting future positions. It would not sacrifice tracking for force. It would preserve sonar contact until the last possible moment. Only then would it strike. This meant attacking forward. It meant replacing timed detonations with contact detonation. It meant accepting smaller explosives in exchange for accuracy. To naval traditionalists, this sounded backward. Smaller charges felt weaker. Quieter weapons felt less aggressive, as even did inferior to one that exploded dramatically, even if it failed just as often. He also understood that it was irrelevant. Explosive power only mattered if it reached the target. Anything else was wasted energy. Worse, it actively helped the enemy escape. When he presented these ideas, resistance was immediate and intense. Senior officers questioned his credentials. He was told that ships could not charge directly at submarines, that contact fuses were unreliable, that forward-thrown weapons violated established doctrine. But doctrine had become the problem. What made his proposal especially threatening was not that it undermined many at once. It challenged training manuals, procurement decisions, and decades of accumulated authority. Accepting it would require admitting that countless attacks had failed for reasons that had been misunderstood. This was not merely a tactical disagreement, it was an institutional reckoning. And institutions resist reckoning, so the idea was dismissed, not with data, but with language. It was labeled unsound, wasteful, impractical, dangerous. The words varied, but the intent was consistent: to isolate the idea before it spread. The outsider persisted. He did not argue emotionally. He argued mathematically. He demonstrated that multiple small projectiles launched ahead of a ship in a pattern created a higher chance of at least one hit than a handful of massive explosions dropped blindly. He explained that misses would not generate noise, that sonar contact would remain intact, that submarines would not receive warning until impact. War was loud. Victory was violent. Silence felt like weakness. Yet the numbers refused to go away. A contact-detonated projectile did not need to breach a pressure hold to kill a submarine. A shock wave transmitted directly through the steel was enough. Precision replaced brute force. Geometry replaced. Gessider was not claiming certainty. He was claiming improvement. That distinction mattered to him. It mattered far less to those protecting the status quo. Months passed. Prototypes were built quietly, almost reluctantly. Tests were conducted with minimal enthusiasm. Reports were filed and ignored. The weapon was judged by the absence of kills, rather than the absence of opportunity. Escorts were stretched thinner. The cost of inaction grew heavier than the discomfort of change. Eventually, practicality began to erode resistance. The decision to proceed did not come from consensus. It came from desperation, a limited trial, a handful of ships, a narrow window of time. If it succeeded, it would force a reckoning no one was prepared for. This was the moment when theory met survival. For the outsider, it was never about vindication. It was about resolving a contradiction that should not have existed in the first place. A navy fighting a war while deliberately choosing to lose sight of its enemy. When the new weapon was finally installed on an escort ship and prepared for combat, the stakes were clear. Either decades of naval belief were correct, or they were about to be exposed as lethal superstition. The ocean would decide. The trial was never supposed to be decisive. On paper, it was a compromise designed to end an argument, not to start a revolution. A small number of ships, a limited deployment, a quiet experiment buried beneath larger operations. The Navy had tried innovation and proven the old methods right. If it succeeded, the implications would be far more uncomfortable. That was why expectations were kept deliberately low. The escort crews who received the new launchers were not briefed with promises. They were warned instead. The system was unconventional. Procedure different for everything they had trained for. There would be no dramatic explosions. If the attack missed, there would be nothing to see at all. For sailors, accustomed to the violence of depth charges, this felt wrong. The launcher itself looked unimpressive. Rows of small projectiles mounted forward on the ship's deck, angled outward like a crude mechanical trap, compared to the massive racks of depth charges snacked at the stern. It seemed almost fragile. Some officers dismissed it outright as a desperate gesture. Others said nothing, reserving judgment for the sea. The first time it was used in combat, there was no announcement of history in the making. There was only a sonar contact. A submerged submarine had been detected ahead of the convoy. Conditions were poor, visibility was low. The escort ship accelerated, bow cutting through cold Atlantic water. In the sonar room, the contact remained steady. Bearing, range, depth. For once, the picture did not dissolve as the ship closed in. Under the old method, the attack run would have ended with charges rolling off the stern, sonar screens erupting into noise, and a long wait filled with uncertainty. This time, the ship did not pass over the target. It charged directly toward it. To the officers on the bridge, it felt like madness. Attacking forward meant committing fully with no dramatic release, no immediate confirmation, no visual reassurance. It required trust in numbers rather than instinct. The order was given, the launcher fired. The sound was sharp but brief, more like a volley of rifles than an explosion. Projectiles arced forward and vanished into the sea ahead of the ship, landing in a precise pattern calculated not for spectacle but for probability. There was no eruption, no towering spray, just silence for a moment. Nothing happened. The sonar operator called out the contact again. It was still there. The submarine had not escaped. It had not vanished beneath noise or confusion. It was exactly where the mathematics predicted it would be seconds earlier. Then the ocean responded, one explosion, then another, then a third, not distant, not muffled. Direct the water ahead of the ship churned. Bubbles surged to the surface. Oil spread outward in a dark stain. On the sonar screen, the contact fractured and collapsed, breaking into chaotic echoes that descended rapidly. This was not the ambiguous aftermath of a depth charge attack. There was no waiting, no doubt, no need to circle back and search again. The kill was immediate, unmistakable. For the crew, the realization arrived slowly. Then all at once they had just destroyed a submarine without sacrificing awareness, without guesswork, without blinding themselves. The thing they had been trained to accept as unavoidable had simply not happened. The implications were enormous. Reports were filed. Data was collected. One successful attack could be dismissed as chance. 2 raised eyebrows. 3 forced attention. More ships were fitted. More encounters followed. The pattern-held attack that maintained sonar contact produced results at rates previously considered impossible. Misses were silent, denying submarines the warning they relied on. Hits were devastating, detonating directly against hulls, rather than somewhere nearby. Submarine commanders noticed immediately. Captured reports described confusion and panic. There was no thunder to announce danger, no familiar rhythm of explosions followed by escape. Escorts seemed to know exactly where the submarine was even during the attack. Evasion tactics that had worked for years failed without explanation. The ocean had changed within months. The statistics told a story Doctrine could not ignore. Escort groups equipped with the new weapon were sinking submarines at multiples of the old success. The balance that had sustained the submarine campaign collapsed. What had been labeled impractical was now unavoidable. The Navy faced a choice it could no longer postpone: continue defending a belief that reality had disproven, or accept that the problem had never been insufficient force. It had been misplaced confidence. Convoys grew bolder. Escorts hunted rather than reacted. Submarine commanders altered routes, then withdrew entirely from the most dangerous areas. The sea lanes began to reopen. For the first time in years, the numbers moved in the Allies' favor. This was not a miracle weapon. It did not make submarines operate uncertainty. By maintaining contact, the escorts denied submarines the space they needed to survive. The war beneath the waves transformed from a guessing game into a pursuit governed by geometry and timing. The belief that had dominated naval thinking for decades collapsed in silence. There was no ceremony marking the end of depth charge supremacy. The change happened the way all revolutions in doctrine do. Gradually, then suddenly, ships requested the new weapon by name. Commanders demanded it. Training manuals were rewritten. Procurement priorities shifted. What had once been dismissed as unsound became standard. And the old belief faded, not because it had been debated into submission, but because it could no longer explain what was happening in the water. 3 submarines surfacing at once would have sounded impossible. Months earlier, a fluke, a story exaggerated in hindsight. Now it was evidence. Bigger explosions had never been the answer. Seeing clearly had been. The impact of the new approach did not arrive as a single dramatic announcement. It spread quietly, convoy by convoy, report by report. Until denial became impossible, escort groups that had once measured success by survival began measuring it by kills. The change was not subtle. Ships equipped with the forward-throwing weapon began reporting something that had been rare, almost mythical in the early years of the Atlantic War. Repeated, confirmed submarine destructions, not weeks apart, not scattered across different theaters, but clustered, consistent, and unmistakable. Where depth charge attacks had required dozens of attempts for a single success, the new method delivered results in a fraction of that number. The success rate did not merely improve, it multiplied. What had once been considered an acceptable exchange suddenly looked indefensible by comparison. Escort captains who had spent years reacting to torpedo strikes now found themselves dictating engagements. They could maintain contact, adjust their approach in real time, and strike without warning. The uncertainty that had defined anti-submarine warfare began to evaporate. For submarine crews, the psychological effect was devastating. The familiar warning signs disappeared. There was no thunderous barrage to mass movement, no predictable window to escape. The destroyer did not overshoot and circle back. It stayed on top of them, relentlessly precise. The sea had stopped providing refuge, reporting a new Allied weapon that attacked silently from ahead, with lethal accuracy. Traditional evasion tactics failed. Diving deeper no longer guaranteed safety. Slipping beneath thermal layers no longer broke pursuit. The mathematics of the campaign began to reverse. Submarine loss climbed faster than training pipeline could replace crews. Boats were lost with experienced commanders aboard, eroding institutional knowledge. Patrol duration shortened. What had once been a calculated campaign of attrition began to resemble a trap. Allied planners, watching these trends emerge, faced a rare moment of clarity. For years they had been chasing improvements at the margins, better coordination, slightly improved sensors, cremamon refinements. Now they were seeing what happened when the core assumption changed. This was not immediately visible to civilians. There were no headlines announcing victory beneath the waves. But fewer ships failed to arrive. Cargoes reached ports that had once expected losses. Food stocks steadied. Fuel reserve recovered. The existential pressure that had haunted Britain's leadership began to lift, improve, as stench fed on itself. As coverage improved, submarines faced greater risk. As risk increased, patrols withdrew. The balance tipped, then accelerated by hunters who struck and vanished, became hostile territory for those same hunters. The effectiveness of the new weapon was not limited to a single navy or theater. Installations spread across destroyers, corvettes, and escorts, operating in different oceans under different conditions. The principle remained the same: maintain contact, attack forward, detonate on impact. This simplicity was its strength in the Pacific berets. Escort vessels that mastered the technique achieved kill rates that bordered on the unprecedented. Entire patrol groups were neutralized in days rather than months. What mattered was not geography but method. By mid-1943, German command faced an unambiguous reality. Huaymin holes could be built. Huaying crews could not be trained quickly enough. Each loss carried disproportionate weight. The decision to withdraw from the most dangerous convoy routes marked the true turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic. Not because submarines ceased to exist, but because they could no longer dominate. The hunters had become cautious. For Allied sailors, the transformation was palpable. Convoys sailed with confidence rather than dread. Escorts pursued contacts aggressively instead of defensively. The rhythm of operations solidified. There was little celebration within the institutions that had resisted change. They come with quiet revisions, manual rewritten without commentary, training programs adjusted without apology. Weapons once dismissed integrated as standard, without acknowledgement of the error that delayed them. The belief that had nearly cost the Allies the war at sea faded without ceremony. No one announced its demise. It simply stopped being useful. Information mattered more than force. Precision mattered more than spectacle. Seeing the enemy continuously was more valuable than hitting the water violently. But hindsight was a luxury purchased with lives. The convoys that finally reached port safely carry more than supplies. They carry proof that the war had not been won by overwhelming strength alone, but by the courage to abandon a comfortable belief. The ocean had not changed. The submarines had not become weaker overnight. What changed was the willingness to accept that the problem had never been solved by doing more of the same. Once that realization took hold, the outcome of the Atlantic War followed inevitably. The sea lanes reopened, the flow of men and material accelerated, the strategic foundation for every Allied operation that followed was secured, and all of it hinged on a single uncomfortable truth. For years, the Allies had not been losing because the enemy was too clever. They had been losing because they were fighting blind. Statistics can be ignored. Individual victories can be dismissed as luck, but patterns that repeat under pressure leave no room for denial. The final proof did not come from a committee or a revised doctrine. It came from a single ship operating far from the Atlantic, applying the same principle with ruthless consistency. By the spring of 1944, the logic behind forward-throwing attacks was no longer experimental. Crews who trained with it understood what mattered most: discipline, timing, and trust in continuous contact. When those elements aligned, submarines did not escape. One escort would demonstrate the truth more clearly than any report ever could. Operating in the Pacific, the destroyer Escort US England was tasked with hunting enemy submarines, threatening Allied operations. Unlike the Atlantic, where vast convoy routes diluted encounters, the Pacific offered concentrated hunting grounds. Submarines still relied on stealth, depth, and evasion. The first contact was detected at long range. Sonar held steady, bears tightened. The ship maneuvered with confidence born of repetition, not improvisation. There was no rush to attack blindly, no premature release of weapons. The crew waited until geometry, not instinct, dictated action. When the launcher fired multiple detonations against the hull, the contact vanished in fragments. Debris surfaced soon after. It was not treated as a miracle. It was treated as confirmation. Days later, another contact, same procedure, same discipline, same outcome. Not scattered across months or supported by overwhelming force. 6 deliberate hunts, executed methodically, each ending with the same unmistakable result. The ocean did not offer ambiguity. Hull fragments surfaced, oil slicks spread, sonar contacts shattered and disappeared. No other ship in history had achieved such a record in such a short time. What made this achievement impossible to dismiss was not the number alone, but the consistency of method. Each engagement followed the same sequence: detection, jacking, forward attack, continuous contact, impact detonation. Not because England was exceptional, but because its results were reproducible. Other crews trained the same way achieved similar success, not at the same pace, but at rates that made the old methods indefensible. This was the moment the debate ended. No amount of institutional pride could explain away 6 submarines destroyed in 12 days, using a weapon once dismissed as inadequate. No amount of tradition could reconcile those results with a doctrine that required dozens of blind attacks for a single success. The argument was no longer theoretical. Submarine commanders recognized the shift instantly. Captured officers described a new kind of fear. There was no warning, no thunder to signal opportunity. The destroyer remained present, persistent, precise. Escape routes closed before they could be exploited. One survivor described it as being hunted by something that never blinked, the psychological advantage. Now it was the submarine crews who questioned whether diving deeper or running harder would make any difference. The ocean no longer belonged to them. For Allied planners, the implications extended beyond anti-submarine warfare. The success of forward-throwing attacks demonstrated something assumptions. That challenge, that effectiveness was not always found by adding power, but by removing wasted information, preserved at the right moment, outweighed force applied blindly. Doctrine shifted accordingly. Weapons based on the same principle appeared across fleets: improved launchers, greater ranges, better fire control, but the core insight remained unchanged. Let precision do what spectacle never could. By the end of the war, hundreds of submarines had been destroyed using variations of this method. Shipping losses fell dramatically. Convoy routes stabilized. The logistical foundation of Allied operations held firm. The Atlantic was secured not by overwhelming the ocean with explosives, but by learning how not to lose sight of the enemy. Yet even as this lesson reshaped naval warfare, its origin remained uncomfortable. It required acknowledging that the old belief had not merely been inefficient, that years of effort had been spent reinforcing a system that rewarded failure with familiarity. History tends to remember victories as inevitable. They rarely are. The proof provided by a single ship ended the argument, but it also exposed how long the argument had been avoided, and that realization carried a weight beyond the war itself. Because if such a costly error could persist for decades in a professional, disciplined institution under existential threat, then the problem was not ignorance, it was confidence. Confidence in what had always been done, confidence in what looked powerful, confidence in beliefs that felt right, even as reality contradicted them. The only question left was whether anyone would remember why it had taken so long to listen. When the war ended, the Atlantic grew quiet again. Convoys no longer burned in the night. Sonar rooms no longer lived on constant edge. The crisis that had once threatened to starve an island nation faded into memory, replaced by victory narratives and familiar names. The weapon that helped turn the tide remained in service. Variations of it appeared in navies around the world. Forward attacks, continuous tracking, impact detonation. Modern technology refined the execution, but not the insight. Yet the lesson that mattered most was the one least discussed. The Battle of the Atlantic was not saved by a stronger enemy making a mistake. It was saved when the Allies finally stopped defending a belief that felt right, but failed in practice. For years, the war had been shaped not by what was impossible, but by what went unquestioned. The depth charge did not nearly lose the war because it lacked power. It nearly lost the war because it fit too comfortably inside an existing whale. It looked decisive. It sounded violent. It reassured those using it that they were acting aggressively, even as results told another story. That is how dangerous beliefs survive. They persist not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Because challenging them feels like an attack on competence rather than an attempt at improvement. The ocean did not reward confidence. It rewarded clarity. Once continuous contact replaced blind force, the outcome followed inevitably. Submarines did not become weaker. the sea did not become kinder. History often celebrates innovation as genius, but this story is not really about invention. It is about subtraction, removing noise, removing assumption, removing the idea that power must announce itself to be effective. That is why the lesson fades so easily. It is uncomfortable to admit that lives were lost not because solutions were unavailable, but because they were dismissed. That expertise can become a shield against inconvenient questions, that institutions under pressure can cling hardest to the ideas that harm them most. The quiet revolution beneath the waves did not come from certainty, it came from doubt, from someone willing to look at a 5% success rate and ask whether the problem was not the enemy but the method, from the courage to say that doing more of the same was not perseverance but avoidance. The Atlantic War was won when that question was finally allowed to stand, not because the answer was complex, but because it had been ignored for far too long. This victory didn't come from brute force. It came from questioning an idea everyone else defended. If you want more forgotten World War II stories that challenge what history made comfortable, subscribe to the channel. These are the wars that textbooks skip and the beliefs that nearly cost everything.